Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our Anzac Day Artist Talk with Greer Townshend. So today we are on a meeting virtually on our Zoom platform. I can see we've got quite a few people in, so thank you for making the time and booking in for this fantastic event. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And just very briefly and quickly, I'd just like to let everyone sort of know with the event today, our cameras are, well, we shouldn't have any visuals. I think we have a few people popping up, but we'll be closing down cameras and audio will only be coming from Greer and Tess for the time being. And we will have a Q&A session at the end of the artist talk where you can ask any questions that you do have of Greer and Tess. So I'll hand on over to Greer and Tess and we can get this session started. Have a great event, everyone, and I'll talk to you all later.
Thank you. Thanks, Phoebe.
Thanks, Phoebe. Well, everyone, I'll start. My name is Tess Maunder and I'm so happy to be here today. And thank you so much to Phoebe from Museum of Brisbane for that beautiful introduction. As you all know, today is Anzac Day. And what a strange time to be celebrating or, you know, acknowledging Anzac Day in COVID-19 and, you know, and us now sitting here in front of our screens. So I actually do think today is a beautiful opportunity for us to reflect on the research that Greer's done and also to think back in terms of what this day might mean to us, our families, friends, and all of that sort of thing. So my name is Tess Maunder. I'm from Brisbane originally, but now I'm currently in Melbourne and I'm manager of a magazine called Vault magazine. And Vault has a Brisbane-based editor called Alison Kubler, who's involved with the Museum of Brisbane as well. So do check us out. I have had a 10-year history as a curator and writer, working in the Asia-Pacific region, and similarly to Greer, I was very fortunate to undertake a residency at the State Library of Queensland with Queensland Memory a few years ago. So yeah, we'll be discussing a bit about that today as well. But now I'll hand over to the star of the show, to Greer, to introduce herself and what we'll be chatting about today. Thanks, Greer.
Yes, for your lovely intro, and thank you again, Phoebe. Thank you also to everybody that has tuned in for our little virtual artist talk. So bear with us if we have any little technical difficulties or anything. So I am a Brisbane-based visual artist, multidisciplinary artist. I'm from New Zealand originally, but have been in Australia for about 7 years. The kind of work I do is primarily large charcoal drawings, portraiture usually, but in the last few years I've moved more into paper sculpture and kirigami, which is paper cutting, so paper folding and paper cutting. And more recently, it's become a little bit more sculptural and become portraits with paper cut light boxes on top of that. So yeah. And yeah, I met Tess when we were both doing fellowships at the State Library, which was lovely, lovely. And yeah, and that's how I've arrived doing this Q ANZAC research.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that, Greer. And I just want to say your studio looks beautiful where you are there today. It's such a creative setting for us all to get an insight into how you work. So thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah, that's so awesome. I guess I would love to hear a bit more about what does it mean to be a fellowship at the State Library and, you know, why for you as an artist did you engage with that and go to the library?
So I can show you a couple of images. First of all, I really love history and research anyway. That's sort of part of my practice is always reading and learning. I love history. So that's usually how my methodology of how I work my way into a show. But in terms of the lead up to applying for the Q ANZAC Fellowship at the State Library, I had a solo show at Noosa Regional Gallery in 2017, and I have a couple of images. So, can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
So I did an exhibition called Heart, which was very large origami hearts, but they were 1.5 by 1.5 meters and unfolded. So the idea was sort of revealing what's inside your heart and what you hold dear to yourself. And as part of that exhibition, I was looking at archetypal symbols and archetypal imagery, and looking at Jungian theory, which the philosopher Jung and his theories on what a simple symbol or image can mean to us and how deep that meaning can be. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But with these works, so you can see the large heart. It's an unfolded heart with a butterfly image. And when it was folded up, it looked like that. So the idea was that the story can sort of change depending on the way that the work was viewed. And as part of that show, I don't have any images there, but I ended up thinking about the sorts of objects that were precious to me, which are often anything that my grandmother gave me, which happened to be objects from the Second World War that my grandfather brought back from her. And she always had the most interesting treasure in her home. She had a basket of all these unusual things, like a necklace from Jerusalem that he brought back. The basket itself was from Jerusalem. And I just found it really interesting. And to me, it really was a type of treasure that had been kept for a very long time. And I sort of wondered what looking at those sorts of symbols and images did to the psyche. And that was sort of how I sort of ended up weaving towards the war. And then I finished that show, and purely by chance, when I was on the State Library website, I saw that they were offering Q ANZAC research fellowships to commemorate 100 years since the First World War. And I just thought, oh, this is perfect, because this is exactly what I would love to go into. And so, yeah, so I applied for it with some of those ideas.
That's so awesome. And I just think it's so wonderful to see major institutions like the State Library of Queensland commit to giving visual artists an opportunity to look at archives and to engage with this. Yeah. You know, because I think something that's really, of course, like our historians are so important to our living memory and history, but what does it mean to ask a creative practitioner to come into something and offer a new perspective? And I think that's so rich for so many people. So yeah, I'm delighted to hear more about your experiences. Okay, great. So maybe let's talk a bit more about after you applied for the residency, what happened when you were when you were there at the residency. How did you start? Did you know what you were looking for straight away, or did you just start going through material and then stories started coming out through that process?
So my proposal was to search for archetypal imagery in the letters, diaries and photographs of Queensland soldiers during the First World War. So it went back to those Carl Jung, the philosopher, looking at his ideas of what an image can mean and its effect that it can have on the subconscious. So my idea was basically to go through all of the letters and diaries and photographs, and particularly the letters and diaries, and basically distill them or put them through a sieve and pull out any kind of images that were repeated or ideas that were repeated throughout it, with the idea that somehow that would give me a kind of insight into what the soldiers were thinking or feeling on a deeper level. So I might have some images to help. Can you see my screen? I don't know if it's worked or not.
I can't see it yet. Oh, yep, it's just come on for myself. Yeah, beautiful.
So what I was doing was I used this book as a reference, basically. This was sort of my Bible throughout the research. So I would look through the letters and diaries, look for symbols, and then reference them in this book of symbols, and also which has sort of over 800 images. Anything as simple as like boat or forest or mountain. If, for example, if a soldier referenced that quite often in his diary, then I would look up and see what those symbols can mean. And archetypal imagery is meaning, an image that has meaning that goes across time and culture. So regardless of when or where in the world, it could be, 4,000 years ago, it could be 10 years ago, it could be in Japan, it could be in New Zealand. There are similarities in how an image affects our psyche. That was sort of Jung's theory on these sorts of things. So my grand idea was to try and use some of those things to figure out what the soldiers might be thinking or feeling. And with Carl Jung's theories, he thought that the self kind of was divided into three. So if you imagine it as a pyramid, at the top there's the ego, which is how we operate on the day-to-day, and we think we know what we're doing, we think we know what we're thinking, etc. Then underneath that there is the personal unconscious, which is sort of repressed memories or things from our past. And underneath that again is the collective unconscious. And that's something that I'm really interested in, and that's what I'm referring to when I say that a single image can have a similar meaning for people across time and culture. So my theory was that if I could find those sorts of things in the letters and diaries, then it would be a way of communicating their feelings to us now, because essentially we would have similar reactions to those sorts of images, if you know what I mean. If I've explained that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that. And I think that's such a, a rich way for artists to draw in that idea of like a layered engagement, not only personal memory, but a collective memory, as with the theorists that you're engaging with. So can you talk us through some of those imagery that had came out through your research, Greer?
Yeah, so the work that's on show right now is of someone called Private Herbert Melion, and I ended up basing his work predominantly on the image of a forest. So you can see. Yeah, and because, where is he? So this is Herbert Melion. He's from Queensland. Here's a couple more images of him. He was 21 when he left from the war in January 1916. And he has, the State Library has an incredible collection. There's 2 years worth of diaries, 2 diaries, the smaller one and then the larger one, which is in a beautiful woven pouch. And his story crosses from training in Egypt, which he doesn't go into much in the diaries, and then moving to the time that he spent on the Western Front, primarily in France and in Belgium a little bit too. And after reading through his diaries, I noticed that here's an image of, they're really beautiful to look at. Wow. After reading through his diaries, I noticed that sort of over the first 14 months, each time there's a longer entry in his diary, it's referring to the destruction of nature. Which I thought, it took me a while to kind of see patterns and things, but I thought that was quite interesting because obviously what he was experiencing and what he was seeing, was awful. All of those atrocities that were happening around him. So I was really interested in the idea that, if you have limited time, resources and energy, what someone is going to take the time to write into a diary, and especially that one there is so tiny, then you're going to be very selective about what you write about. Yeah. And so I was looking into the meaning of forest, what it means to us, and it actually represents the unconscious, ironically, a forest does, because it is sort of outside of the boundary. So normally you would have a village or a town, and then the forest is this sort of mystical, magical thing on the outskirts. So it's outside of our boundary, which can represent the unconscious. You know, and then in mythology and everything, it's always magic or the hero's journey, someone who ventures into the forest, you know, goes on some kind of adventure, defies something and overcomes it, which is another Jungian idea. So there's sort of magic, and there's also rebirth, because the forest regenerates itself and things like that. So the forest is an enormous thing to think about. And with Herbert, in his first year at war, he ended up at a place called Delville Wood, which is that image there, which was part of a series of engagements in the Battle of the Somme in France. And he arrived 4 months after that battle had started, but it was horrific. And, you know, obviously the forest is decimated there. And so I was interested in why he spoke about it. And I've got a little quote from him here. Delville Wood, where the fierce battle was fought sometime previous, has been a death trap for both the enemy and ourselves. Bodies lay there unburied in great numbers. It is a horrible sight. The wood itself is nothing but a mass of charred, broken timber. And it's actually interesting, if you look at his diary, I think it's this one here, you can see that if you just glance at that, Delville Wood is really large, and then Death Trap you can see as well, and then Bodies there, he's written with a capital B. So although he's only talking a very tiny amount about the awful things he saw, he's really going on about nature the most, which I thought was strange. You know, you could talk about all the gruesome things, but he's talking about the destruction of the trees. And he goes on, and throughout the diary there are other extracts which are quite similar to that. So when I was thinking about those sorts of ideas, I ended up focusing his portrait on the forest as his symbol, basically. I was kind of looking for one or two symbols per soldier to try and discuss those ideas.
Yeah, amazing. And do you have an image of that work with you?
So the work finished up like that. This is so they're paper cut light boxes. So there's a portrait of Herbert here, and on the interior is a paper cut light box. And that is it's a series of, I don't know if you guys know what a paper cut light box is, but it's a series of layers of paper underneath that top layer. There's several layers of paper underneath that, which you've cut out, and then there's a light at the back. So at night time, the work looks like this and sort of comes to life in a completely different way to the way you would see it during the day. And so, do you want to talk about the other things inside there? Or?
It's stunning to look at, and I'm just looking at the image as well and totally getting the sense of, you know, the triangle that you're talking about before with the individual memory and collective memory, and I think that really comes out in the work, so I'm just sort of enjoying looking at it. But yes, please do talk us through a little bit about some of the imagery. I see in the image that you have up here now, there seems to be, is it a figure, the figure in the forefront has an animal head, so can you speak to that? And then also in the foreground there appears to be some ballet dancers, so maybe you want to speak to that as well.
Yep. So part of this work, while I was trying to decide what kind of work I wanted to produce as an outcome of the research, something that really struck me when I was reading the letters and the diaries is, because of the period of time, but also because of the character of the person, the way that they write is really, it's this really interesting combination of both grace and strength, which I think is a really unusual combination, going through something so horrific, but the way they phrased it was often quite gentle and thoughtful, and you know, you could hear their strength even when they were scared or worried. You could still see that. And so because of that, I was playing around with ideas, and it occurred to me that that is what ballerinas have, is that beautiful ballet dancers have that beautiful combination of strength and grace. And so when I was thinking about how I wanted to portray how someone was feeling, I kind of thought of having little personifications of different emotions and different experiences. And I thought it would be nice to use dancers to represent all of that. So I contacted the Queensland Ballet Academy, who very kindly said that I could come and do workshops with the dancers. And so I went and did a series of workshops, and I took extracts from the letters and the diaries, and I prepared a series of questions and asked the dancers to respond to what they were reading, and what kind of movements would you make with your body, or how could we express this in different ways. And they were wonderful, and came up with a lot of interesting poses. Where are we? For example, here. And here's some more. So those two were, so going back to the layers of the work, that's sort of mirroring Jung's idea of the layers of the subconscious. So the top layer you see at the start, where there's a lot of forest happening. Something that I haven't mentioned, because I'm sort of speaking out of order, is that when I went into this and I was looking for different soldiers and choosing different soldiers, I didn't read around the soldier's life before just going into the collection. So all I did was just open the letters and diaries and go from there. So I didn't know how old the soldier was, where he was from, whether or not he made it home from war, etc. Because I was trying to figure out how much I could learn about a person through such a narrow window into their experience, and to see if that could be a way of learning more about their subconscious. And I was sort of amazed to learn that after reading about Herbert, I found out that he was from Springshore, if I can find my image, which is a town in Queensland. I think it's about 8 hours north of Brisbane, and is surrounded by lush forests. I also found out that he was a farmhand. So he spent all his time in nature, and then he had a brother, and so all of those sorts of things, I was kind of incorporating that into the image of him. That was why I have the forest as the personal unconscious at the surface level, and then it kind of goes further and further within to where the forest is devastated in that image. So, and also with the dancers surrounding, there's sort of someone laying on the ground in that front section. The dancers surrounding him there were a lot of beautiful stories. There was a beautiful letter that all of his friends came together and sent to his mother, because he didn't make it back from war. And so that sort of represented that. And then with the, sorry, I'm kind of going backwards and forwards, but with the wolf figure, the wolf figure that's in the forest, something else I did was, as part of the fellowship, was have a look through Queensland Museum's collection of anything, icons, sculptures and things from the First World War. And one of the things that one of the soldiers brought home was this, which I found really interesting because I didn't know a lot about Anubis previous to doing this. So Anubis is the god of death. The Egyptian, a lot of people would know it as that, the profile man with the jackal or the wolf face. Do you know what here's an image here. And I was sort of struck by the fact that, because a lot of the soldiers trained in Egypt before going on to France or Gallipoli, so they would collect these little things from Egypt and carry them in their backpacks, maybe to keep for themselves or maybe to give to people back home. But when I saw that someone was carrying around a little god of death in his pocket, to me that's quite intense. There's some intense symbolism. And although it seems quite grim, there's also kind of it's a double-edged sword with Anubis, because he also is a kind of a protector and helps the soul transition and things like that. So he's scary, but he's also kind. It's sort of a strange duality. So that is why I ended up, when I was with the dancers, I asked one of them to be god of death and the other one being the soldier. So they came up with these poses, and originally I did have them the same scale. This was a little mock-up I was doing when I was trying to decide how I wanted to do it on the actual work. And I was going to have, you know, a smaller Anubis, but strangely enough, when I, a few days before I did the paper cuts for the wolf, I had a dream which was about, I had seen an enormous wolf in the forest, and my dream was post that I was in a toy shop, one of those beautiful toy shops where everything is made out of wood and is all clever and beautiful. And I was with my sister and my mother who had bought something for me, and I didn't know what it was. And my sister said, look, they've made a scale model of that large wolf that you saw. And I said, oh no, I don't want that. Why did you get that for me? Like, you know, because it was such a terrifying thing to see this enormous wolf. And then my mother said, no, we didn't get you that. We got you this, and pointed to, and it was a 1,000 piece puzzle of the wolf, which I thought was really interesting because, you know, the more I was reading about it, the wolf is symbolizing death. And I think, I mean, the 1,000 piece puzzle of the wolf, I think, is a good way to describe death, really, you know, with all its mystery and everything. So then I decided to make the wolf figure much larger in the forest.
Yeah, wow. Such amazing imagery in your work, Greer. Wow, it's so interesting to unpack all that stuff. And I do like the comment about the puzzle as well. I think that's, you know, a really nice way to look at something that is as complex as death, and to engage with it in a way that is, you know, piece by piece or a day at a time. So I think that's something that even people might be able to relate to interpersonally a little bit. That's interesting. I wondered, I mean, you've spoken a little bit about your experiences with the Queensland Ballet Academy, but perhaps to some people listening, you know, it's quite unusual that there would be, you know, a visual artist engaging with a dance-based practice. You know, these are two different disciplines. So do you want to talk us through a bit more about like the practicalities of how that happened and how the dancers responded to your proposal?
Sorry, you just cut out just before that. Were you talking about how it was working with the dancers?
Yeah. Sorry if you missed that. But yeah, basically thinking about how you're a visual artist and then, you know, the dancers are from a different discipline, and usually we wouldn't see much interaction between the two disciplines. So can you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, I think Queensland Ballet Academy, I think, are quite proactive and interested in the dancers working with a lot of different artists in a lot of different ways. Mm-hmm. I know that they had a photo shoot with someone else, you know, a week or two later, because they wanted the dancers to have basically opportunities to work with a variety of different artists. And it was really, really lovely. For me, it was so interesting because just to learn about the discipline and the hours that they put in, it's a huge amount of work. You know, it's difficult to get accepted, and they were all really welcoming, really interested in the project, really helpful. And they came up with all of the poses on their own. Like, I would have a general idea of what I wanted, and then they would discuss it and come back with a whole lot of different ideas. And I think one lovely thing was, it was an interesting way to share the collections, which was really nice, because when I gave them the extracts for them to read, you know, but when they learned that it was, you know, because I would put at the top, it was, you know, one of the soldiers I was looking at is someone called Michael Levine, who was a 24-year-old soldier from Toowoomba, a shearer, and it was an extract of a letter that he was writing to his sister. And then Herbert was 21, who we've just been talking about. So I think for the dancers to, you know, some of them are like, oh wow, you know, that's me. And I think that's quite interesting for just to present it in a different way, and to understand that it could be, you know, him and his group of friends, that could be them over there. So I think that's quite interesting, yeah.
And I think that's one of the beautiful things about thinking about culture as being something that's always being ongoing and continuous, right? We even though something happened in the past, yes, it's an archive and it's fixed to a degree, but I think now as the next generation, we have the power to empathize with those positions and to give them light. And I think that's something that is really possible throughout some of the projects that you've done, Greer. And I think for me personally, I think that's really powerful and a way to draw stronger connections with history. So I really applaud you for that, which is fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic. Do you want to, I know you had some beautiful quotes as well from some of your time in the archive. Do you feel like reading some of those out and giving us a bit of context about who the quotes are coming from and where?
Well, I think the thing with Herbert's diary was that, as I was saying, I didn't know, I mean, this isn't a very long quote, but there's 2 years of his diaries, and throughout he's talking about the different things that are happening. And then I got to the end and it was the last entry, and the first thing he says in that top of that last entry is, it's Saturday 29th of September 1917, dull and cloudy this morning, looks as though our run of fine weather is coming to an end. Which is a very simple sentence, but I ended up finding it heartbreaking because I didn't know if what happened. I was really hoping that there was another diary somewhere that I didn't know, or maybe he just stopped writing and he managed to get home or something. But in fact, he died that day. So that, to me, like when he was saying the fine weather is coming to an end, I thought it hurt so much to learn that he hadn't come home. And there are different quotes. There's another quote from him when he was talking about, I might not have it here, but at the beginning of his diary, how much he wanted, at the outset of this diary, I hope that I see the end of the war and I get to go home to everyone in Australia, etc., etc. That's at the very beginning of his second diary, which I thought was quite heartbreaking. And then there's a second, the second person I'm looking at is someone called Reverend George Green, who I've really only just started working on his work, which is somewhere down here. It's very much a whip. These are all whips as I was drawing him, Herbert. They became darker and darker as they went on. And similarly, when I started to work on Reverend George Green, his diaries are really interesting because they only span, I think, 2 years or less than 2 years, and he was the same. He was also in Egypt, and then he ended up in Gallipoli, so he wasn't in France. But so there are 2 diaries of him in Egypt and then 3 of him in Gallipoli. But his diaries are really interesting because at the beginning there's kind of a lot of quotes. He's almost sort of bored in Egypt, and it's training, and he's playing patience, and they don't know what's going on, etc. And then it moves to Gallipoli, and it's really obviously goes downhill from there. Have you seen that film 1917 that came out recently?
I haven't, but it's been on my to-do list, and I've had lots of people that have told me that I should.
Very good. It's very good, and it creates a lot of tension because it's filmed in that long. It's all as if it's one cut type thing. So it's kind of creates this tension because there's no stopping to it. And I sort of think about when you read the diaries, if you're reading kind of a year's worth of diary over a few hours, it can end up having that same effect on you because it's happening faster than it seems like it, and you're kind of moving through things quite quickly, and the tension is building, and his situation just becomes worse and worse in terms of the things that he saw, because with his position as a reverend, he had to do a lot of the burials. He obviously had to provide comfort and guidance to the soldiers, but he had to do a lot of awful, awful burials. And some of the quotes are pretty grim. He says things like, I have been through a time that will never be obliterated from my memory. For courage, I can imagine nothing finer. For horrible sights, nothing could be more awful. Men wounded, dying dead, with bodies shattered. The worst or the best can never be told. it was a little bit different for him because as a Reverend, he had sort of an inner sense that God was watching over him and he was going to make it out of the war. Mm-hmm. But what I noticed was with that kind of become a little bit stranger and stranger, and that musical term popped into my mind because he ends up, you know, he'll say something horrific about the war and then the very next sentence is something kind of gentle and nice, and that starts to happen more and more, and I wondered if that was a way of coping. So he says things like, soldiers buried at sea, bullet just missed intestine and spine, a lovely bath and a good dinner. So it's sort of like one way and the other, and he kind of does that a lot. Two men swiped by moonlight late on way to dinner. It's worse and worse. Burial party report at 10 p.m. did not finish until 3 a.m. A sickening job. Bodies in bits. It's pretty dark as it goes on. And so when I was sort of thinking about that, the other thing, like in terms of archetypal imagery and symbolism, he references the moonlight quite a lot, which I found quite interesting because, you know, in symbolism, obviously it offers light and darkness, which I thought was quite interesting and beautiful. But as I was working on his drawing, it definitely became darker and darker as I went. So, and it ends up, it's a whip, but it's not quite as dark as that in real life. But so I'm playing around with ways to have a stained glass window effect in the center of his image. But yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's a very, you know, that sort of way that the Reverend is reflecting on his time is very much like, you know, the most positive thing of his day and the most negative thing of his day in one way. And I think gives a very interesting snapshot. And yeah, I think you can maybe tell that he might have a sense of humour as well, which is maybe what also helped him get through as well. So it's interesting to see how everyone responds to things differently, and that comes out in the diaries as well. I'm just conscious of time. And of course, Greer, I could speak to you for hours and hours because I love what you've done and I love your research and your practice. But for our lovely participants that are listening today, we would also love to hear from you. And if you have any questions for Greer, now is the time to share them. So I understand that I can receive messages from all of our listeners today. So if anyone would like to submit a question now, I can start feeding those, filtering those and approaching Greer with those. So yeah, if anyone wants to do that, do feel free to go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, I might just ask and just talk a little bit about, you know, what does it mean? I think also I was really interested in what you were saying at the beginning with this idea of you, Greer, and engaging with this history and your grandma and the objects that she had. So do you want to tell us a little, like just really briefly about your own personal history in terms of the war and how your family is connected to it? Because I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, especially on a day like today.
Well, both my grandfathers served in the Second World War. And I know less about my father's involvement, but my grandmother was around for a lot longer. So I would often quiz her about my grandfather and what it was like in the war. But I think the experience was similar to a lot of people's, where they didn't want to talk about it when they came home. And he didn't talk about it at all. He brought a few things home with him, and the only story that I ever knew was that he held his best friend in his arms as he died. And that's pretty much all I know. Other than that, I asked my grandmother what her experience was like, and they were together before he left, and that experience of not knowing how he was and the enormous amount of time between receiving a letter, so you don't know if someone is okay or not. You don't know if they're ever going to come back, and she would receive letters that had bits cut out of them, you know, because the censors would get the letters before they came home. So, I mean, obviously it's very, very different to now. I mean, we're kind of in pseudo-isolation.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So there's some questions coming through, so I'm going to share them. First question was, could Greer show us images of her work on the Reverend so far? Now, Greer, I don't know if that's something you've gone
Sorry.
but maybe if you wouldn't mind sharing that, that would be useful.
Sorry, I thought my internet cut out before, so obviously stopped sharing. So this is the Reverend. Can you see that?
Yeah.
This is the Reverend George Green. He has a lovely smile. I don't have the early drawings of him, but as I was going, they became sort of darker and darker because his story is so dark. And also, there are quite a lot of quotes about him at nighttime in the moonlight. And there's an amazing quote of him while in Egypt. He had sort of a magical experience seeing the Sphinx at nighttime. It had a very kind of deep impact on him, I think. And that's the two works together. It's quite difficult to photograph him because, as you can see, he's getting darker and darker. And this is what he looks like now, which you can barely see. But if you see it in real life, you can sort of see him emerging from the darkness. And so when I think about the moonlight and the Sphinx, he went out, it was like 10 o'clock at night, and he sat in front of the Sphinx, and it was the first time that it had an impact on him. And it's something along the lines of, it almost looked like the Sphinx's eyes were sparkling, and him and a nurse sat there together and thought about how it had been looking out over the desert for centuries, which I thought was really interesting in terms of mortality and everything. So I kind of, whenever I thought of him, I sort of thought about him at nighttime, but the further into the diaries I read, the more I just thought of him in darkness, because of how unbelievably difficult it was, the sorts of things he was seeing. And you can definitely see him struggle more and more as time goes by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wow. Some other questions that are coming through is a question people are asking, where can audiences see more of your work, Greer? So obviously your work is exhibited now at Museum of Brisbane, but perhaps if there's any other ways that people can connect with your work, if you'd like to share that.
TBC at the moment. I'm not sure where I'm going to show next. There's a couple of bodies of work that I want to make quite a big series of the World War I soldiers' works. So I'm not sure yet where I'll show those, because I would like to show quite a lot of soldiers and have them in quite a dark space. But at this point, nothing's been confirmed. So I'll have to let you know.
And in terms of staying up to date with things from yourself, could we look at your website if we were interested in following, where this TBC goes?
Yep, website, Instagram. Facebook.
Yeah, great.
Facebook, more Instagram. Yeah.
And even Museum of Brisbane will have some documentation. Yep. And I also imagine State Library website, maybe?
Yeah, there's some information on my initial research, and I did a work in progress talk there, and there's some other info on the work I did with the dancers on the State Library website still, under the Q ANZAC fellowships.
Yeah, amazing.
Yep.
Great, okay, that's lots to continue with after today.
Yep.
And there's another question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this, Greer, you might, but it might be something that we might have to get further consultation on. But we've got a question that says, do the state archives at State Library of Queensland hold many World War I records and photos? I thought I had to go to the Canberra archives. So that's one person's question. So, Greer, obviously you're not a librarian yourself, but as a visitor and as a fellow, what is your response to that question?
The question is just in general, is there a large collection relating to the festival?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, it's a very large collection, and there's also a website called Q ANZAC 100, not sure if it's .com.au, which is a sort of a branch off the State Library website, and that has a lot of information on the soldiers and the collections in the State Library. But it's definitely, once everything calms down and we can go back to the library, I mean, you can look at it online as well, actually, I should point that out. that if you go into the State Library website, all of, like, for example, Herbert's diaries, Reverend George's diaries, you can see all of it online. Like, a huge amount of the State Library's collections have been digitalized.
Yeah.
And also, they've also been transcribed. So, you know, because of the era and because of the nature and because of the age of the diaries, it can be quite difficult to read them. So they've been transcribed, which is a lot faster to read. It's beautiful to look at the actual diaries, but all of that's online, so you can go and search Herbert Mellion or Reverend George Green and you can see so much. But there's a huge amount, and anybody can go and request to see these diaries, and then you can go in and have a look at them. They, you know, give you gloves, and it's an amazing thing to do, and I hope more people do it because it's really a wonderful and important thing to do, I think.
Absolutely agree, and I think that's something that myself doing my fellowship at the library as well, just realising the amazing people that work at our libraries and the dedication and knowledge there, and the resources that are available, and just that they are publicly available, you know, some stuff online that we can access now, and some obviously when our current world situation changes, we can hopefully go in again in person and engage materially with the archives as well. So yeah, we'd obviously encourage everyone to, you know, make the most of that resources there that we all have at our fingertips. And I think with today, with Anzac Day, I mean, that sounds like a great afternoon activity, is having a bit of a look online at the State Library website as well. Yes, and I was going to ask a little bit, just last question was a bit about what, you know, if there's any other artists that are listening today or anyone that would like to apply for the residency at the State Library, do you have any advice for people?
I just think go for it.
Yeah.
I think, well, I mean, the Q ANZAC fellowships aren't available anymore, but there are a lot of different fellowships that are still available at the State Library. I'm not sure if the rounds are open at the moment, but if you go and have a look in the John Oxley Library and the State Library collection, you know, anything that you're interested in at all, there are fellowships that, you know, I know there's a business one, and then there's the general John Oxley Fellowship. You know, there are opportunities open for artists, and you know, the State Library is very forward-thinking and open-minded. So whatever your idea is, get it together and send it in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like with the general public, you know, using the resources that are available in the same way. If you are an artist or a researcher, think about the opportunities that are available for you, and you know, to use Greer as an inspiring example of what is possible through, you know, this amazing time and having access to these resources as well. We've got a few minutes left. Thank you so much to everyone that has asked questions. If there are any last questions, now is your time. We've received some comments saying how interesting this has been, so thank you so much. But yeah, I guess want to also say thanks to everyone at Museum of Brisbane for putting today on. I do understand that this is the first Zoom talk that Museum of Brisbane have done, and I think that they've done a brilliant job. And I feel very honoured to be in the first Zoom meeting here with you all today. So I really want to thank everyone for that as well. Okay, we've had one last question come through, so this might be the last question that we can take just in terms of time. And the question is for you, Greer, just wondering if any of the soldiers in the proposed works came home and if that changes the work at all. So I'm not sure if you have access to that knowledge or if you can speak to that question at all.
Out of the soldiers that I've been looking at?
That's right, yes.
So two of them, Michael Levine and Herbert Mellion, didn't come home.
Yeah.
And Reverend George Green did come home. He actually was from England originally, and then he ended up going back to England later. But I did sort of want to focus on the soldiers that didn't come home, because I think it's nice to, you know, I think it's nice that we're all thinking about those people now and saying their names, and a work exists in the Museum of Brisbane on that person. And so in a sense, it's bringing a little bit of them home, which was quite important to me. And because it's quite heartbreaking that they couldn't come home.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's a very touching point to end on, and I think it's really nice that you've given light to a few different examples of these people that are in all of our memories. So thank you so much for that, Greer. Was there anything else that Museum of Brisbane had to speak to? Phoebe, was there anything that you wanted to say before we finish?
Yes, just firstly wanted to say thank you so much for today's session. Absolutely fascinating, and it was really great to get that insight into Greer's practice. Also, I'd like to mention to all of our viewers that there is actually an online exhibition that we have put out. It's Remembering First World War I. Sorry, I just got my name wrong. Sorry about that. But remembering the First World War. So you can actually go and look at one of our previous exhibitions that has a lot of ANZAC content. There's some videos and beautiful imagery in there as well, and some Brisbane social history. So I do recommend that everyone pop over there as well. Additionally, Greer has developed an activity for all ages, a paper folding activity where you can make a love heart and then you can make it into a poppy. So it's called Sending Love from Afar, and you can find a video instructional on the website, and you can make your own poppy today as well. So hopefully, you know, from this session, everyone's, you know, learnt a lot, but then has also some great opportunities to kind of connect a little bit further this afternoon.
Absolutely.
All right, well, unless there's anything else, any other questions, I'd just like to say, yeah, again, a big thank you for everyone coming today. And I really hope you enjoyed our first Zoom session. There will be more to come. So if you haven't already, please make sure you subscribe to the Museum of Brisbane, and we'll keep you updated with upcoming events. Just to, yeah, keep everyone, you know, really engaged during this time. So thank you for everyone.
Thank you.
I think there's a link on in the chat to our website and our exhibitions if anyone wants to yeah, follow up. Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.